me to speak. I'm very humbled actually in the company. As I look around, I know so many people and so many of you who have been around as long as I have and some even longer. I was one of the people who was around the table 20 years ago, and I looked a lot different, I think. I hope. I don't know. Anyway, it doesn't matter really. But I suppose you kind of know you've been around a long time when people ask you to look historically at something. One of my nieces, I keep trying to convince her that history is really interesting, and she's like, oh God, yawn. So the last thing I want to do this morning is for you to kind of think, oh God, this is really boring. But actually, I decided not to go back over. I'm supposed to be flicking as I talk here. Sorry. I decided not to go back over what I did in a webinar with IDEA a couple of years ago, which was to kind of chart some of the changes historically in Dev Ed or global education in Ireland over the last 30 years. A lot of that is now actually documented. At least we're starting to document it. And as Elaine mentioned, I co-edited, I've just been working on this for the last 2 years, a book on kind of critically looking back at the history of global education in Ireland with Niamh Gaynor, Gerard McCann and Stephen McCluskey, and lots of people in the room here who contributed chapters and case studies, and we're really delighted. I really appreciate all your contributions and your work, and we're delighted that this will be available freely, free of charge, open access to everyone from the 17th of October, and we hope we'll have a launch of it at some stage as well. And to me, that's really important. I have found as I have gotten older that I really want to document stuff a lot more. Like, for example, the work that Tony has been doing with developmenteducation.ie. That is really important. Or the work that Stephen has been doing with policy and practice. And so many of us here have contributed to that. But the older I get, the more I think we really need to document, but not document in a kind of a self-congratulatory way, but in a way which kind of critically asks, what has worked well, what hasn't worked well? And I guess that's what I'm trying to do today. So I'm really I was saying to Elaine earlier on, she said, you're not nervous, are you? And I thought, oh my God, I am nervous, of course I am. Partly because the story is so rich. Partly it's so challenging. And I can't do justice to that today. So no matter what I do, I'm only tipping the surface, and any of you up here could say it differently. So my job is literally just to throw in a few ideas and hopefully stimulate you for the rest of the day. I don't know. Or you might kind of think, I really didn't like what she said about this, that, and the other, and that's great too. So I'm not in any way setting myself up as any expert at all. I'm like most of you. I've been doing my best as an educator in challenging circumstances, sometimes pretty well and sometimes pretty awfully. But that's where we're at, and that's where I'm coming from. I don't know what's up there. Oh yeah, so here's one of the first controversial things. I'm actually going to talk about global education and not global citizenship education or development education, but recognizing that the history of global education in Ireland has largely come out of a development education discourse. Moving more now, we talk, like if you were to chart the discourses in strategies, we've moved from Dev Ed to global citizenship education as the umbrella term in Ireland, and education for sustainable development. But I worked in Amnesty for a couple of years in human rights education. There are people in the room who are anti-racist educators or intercultural education. So all of these adjectival, as we call them, educations are really important. And at a European level, they're using the term global education as the catch-all. I'm not suggesting it's any better. I'm just saying I'm using it today as the catch-all, in line with the Dublin Declaration kind of definitions. Again, none of these things are unproblematic, but it's a shorthand for me. I hope you're still following me. What I mean by global education for me is not global learning. It implies a critical perspective and a post-critical perspective. And the influences on me, and I think this is always something to highlight for ourselves. I personally have been influenced by critical pedagogy, Paulo Freire's work, Bell Hooks's work. I think all of us in the room owe a massive debt to the incredible work that Vanessa Andreotti has been doing, and her colleagues. And that has changed the way we think about global education. We no longer think about global education in these simple aspirational terms, as if it's something that can easily be done. We know now, and well, I don't know, I actually used to think that if we understood stuff, we could change it. But actually, we know now that things are a lot more complex, a lot more intractable, and we know that we continue to play a role in all of this. So anyway, I'm assuming a radical, transformative, critical and post-critical understanding of global education in how I use it. And I suppose for me, centrally important is the role of global education in helping us to understand our relationships in the world. And I partly owe that to Aidan, who's here, who himself has been talking about global education as relational for many years. He's not the only one, others as well. But actually, the more we think about global education, the more it's, for me anyway, it's about how we relate to all aspects of life and understanding when those relationships break down, when they're, I suppose, they're ruptured, and when we're disconnected from what's going on. Anyway, so you thought you were getting history, but actually you're getting philosophy, because I find it essential. We have to know who we are, what we're about, where we're coming from, and put criticality and radicalness at the heart of that. For me, anyway, that's important. Now, so I'm not very good at graphics. I'm a 20th century person, so this is as much as I could manage. So I'm sorry about that. So I wanted, and in line with a chat with Elaine, to talk a little bit about the difference that global education has made looking to the future. So it's about what difference does global education make, but also what's different in global education now, 20 years after IDEA, okay? And I wanted to look at differences in terms of understandings, policy, curriculum, and IDEA and the organization of global ed. So that's what I'm going to frame my talk around mostly. But in the interim, I'd like to just tell you why I have been involved in global education for 30 years. And I spent quite a bit of time thinking about this over the last month or so. And I guess one of the things is, you know, sometimes when you are a strong critic of something, which I am, of discourses of global education as not radical enough, then you wonder, why are you so committed to it? Why do we spend, knowing that it's not, as the video said, it's not perfect, why does one stick with it? And I reflected back on an evaluation that I did back in the 1990s in Kolov, when I was a volunteer with Kolov. And one of the things that really kept me in Dev Ed at the time was the people I worked with. And that might sound ridiculous to other people, but I like working with nice people. And yeah, it's true, you know, I suppose. And also people who are also committed to change. So over the years, I've had the privilege of working with lots and lots of really strong, interesting, challenging people. First off, as a secondary teacher in Fermoy, I worked for 10 years as a secondary teacher. And I used to do concern debates and One World Weeks and stuff like that with the kids in school. And even then, the kids would, I've people coming back to me saying that experience changed the way I thought about things. It's really amazing. But also, I was always challenged by it. And in Cambridge, working with Cambridge and at Maynooth University, working with development workers from Ireland and around the world, activists, educators, it's a privilege to be an educator and a learner at the same time. And that for me has always been really important, where my own ideas have been challenged, my own approaches. One person who worked with DNL in Liberia, anyway, this is a development education network in Liberia. One day she said to me, "For God's sake, Eilish, what are you talking about? We need Freire." And I was like, okay. But the point being that the space was one where together we learned critically, and I hope that's what it's all about. So people have been very inspirational. Sorry, I'm getting nervous here because I know I'm going over my time. Sorry about that. I need to calm down a little bit, sorry. Okay, so the next bit is, I suppose what's also important, and we saw it there in the video, is that I have actually been inspired personally by changes that have been brought about through long-standing campaigns. And if there was one thing I wanted to bring to today, it's this kind of a sense that David is not for classrooms. Sorry, I wonder, could I have some water, please? Thanks a million. It's also for big campaigns. So over the years, anti-apartheid campaign, right throughout the history of change, I guess. Drop the Death campaign, Make Poverty History. All these big campaigns have had a huge education dimension to them. Thanks. Yeah. Okay, so basically, thanks, Mel. Basically, I guess the point is that unless we change our understanding of the world, and we can't really change the world. And for me, global education at its heart is about changing the world. Why? Because the world is really not great. It is great, but so much needs to change. So, sorry, this has never happened to me before. I honestly, I know I'm not nervous. Thanks very much. I'm actually not nervous, but I feel a cold is coming on, so apologies for that. So it's fine. Thank you very much for your understanding. I don't know where my voice has gone funny. So basically, I suppose with campaigning, the whole point is that if we think about global education as just being about for classrooms or for little education contexts, then we're reducing it to an add-on to our lives. Whereas if we see it as about being seriously part of movements for change, then I guess that's where, I suppose that's what's always inspired me. So I'm going to leave bell hooks to some of the talking for me now. So the classroom and these other education spaces, all education spaces she highlights, are important locations of possibility. And it's there that we can transgress beyond boundaries. So moving on, I guess, one of the things is that we often can't, as Elaine said, we can't measure easily the effects of global education. It's really difficult. But we sometimes see it, and not enough at all, in the decisions that politicians make. It's basically about the kind of society that we create. Excuse me. A key aspect or question about global education. Thanks a million. Thanks a million. Thanks. A key aspect or question, I suppose, about global education, and one of the things that I've often been asked is, aren't we doing enough in global education? And my sense is we're not doing enough at all. And global education and development education has for years been on the back pages of policy. It's the last thing on the policy. There are global education policies, but when you think about development cooperation, It's always on the last page. And I'm not the first person to say that. So an awful lot more needs to be done. So politicians, when we see it in practice, in protests, we hope we see it when people refuse to accept a kind of a misogynistic, populist, racist society. So it is about our society. But it's clear we need far more of it. And things do, though, move on. And I was delighted recently to be able to go to the first ever Pride March in Roscommon. You know, Roscommon was the only place that voted against. And Val won't be too happy that I mentioned that. But anyway, there you go. But it was fantastic to be able to walk down the street in Roscommon behind pride flags. So things move on. Sorry. Actually, if I whisper, maybe I might be better. So I really apologize. So looking back, we're going to take a critical historical perspective. And you're kind of thinking, when is she going to actually start this talk? So I'm going to start it now with the question, is it really a story of success? Or is that actually the question we should be asking at all? So I asked that myself. I had that on a slide and I thought, sure, success, what's success? Maybe it's not about success. It's about, are we relevant or radical enough or effective enough? Or is our Dev Ed, our global citizenship education, making the difference that it needs to make in our society? And if it's not, why not? Maybe we need to educate ourselves more. Maybe we all need to be going to more training. One of the things I've done recently is some research on ethical global communications with DOCUS. And it's really highlighted to me the essential nature of deep organizational learning. We assume we know stuff. We assume that we're on top of things. And we put in a policy of EDI or anti-racism here or there. Actually, not half enough anti-racism, as far as I'm concerned. But deep change really needs to happen. So I want to look, so we need to question that. We need to question that. So I want to look at our understandings of global education and the changes that have happened. Loads has happened. Fantastic stuff has happened over many years. We've moved from, back in 2002, Michael Kenny and Siobhan O'Malley had a report. They said we need more clarity on the definition of Dev Ed in Ireland. We need a structure. IDEA came out of that. But actually what we've moved to is a much more embracing understanding of global education in Ireland, where everybody in the room with different perspectives is valid, everybody's valid. And at the same time, lots of different articulations, the Maastricht Declaration 2004, the Dublin Declaration. There are so many articulations of what global education is now. So much so that it can sound so aspirational and vacuous and empty. You know, it sometimes sounds great, but actually it needs a lot of work. So there is a lot more breadth and depth in policy, and lots of really good projects like the Bridge 47, deep. And we've seen how working together and at a European level, engaging with policymakers working with civil society, how important that has been. It's been really, really significant. So a lot of really substantial change and advancement has happened, but there are huge issues with some of our articulations of our understanding. My own sense is that we really need to be keeping that relationality and connections far more at the heart of our policy. So if you do a quick trawl through policy, you will see that some policies mention other policies, but some don't. So policy articulation tends to be very trend-setting. These days, it's very much about futures. It's very much about empathy. You could do a whole analysis of policy for its individualization, the fact that it focuses on individual action, not so much on collective action or structural analysis. Often policies sound lovely, but they're not coherent with other policies. So to what extent does the national strategy on anti-racism address global citizenship education? Are they linked? To what extent are people... I'm a major critic of the SDGs and how weak they are. But now they're going off the agenda altogether. They're not trendy so much anymore. So what happens? So the futures discourses tend to be about technical solutions, not about understanding the structural, neoliberal included causes of global poverty, inequality, overconsumption, climate change. So there's a huge body of work to do to keep an eye on policy. We can't assume that just because the policies are there, that they're great. God, I've got my voice back, this is fantastic. Or, even if they are there, that they're properly implemented. So that's one thing in understanding, and I'll repeat that ad nauseum again. Second thing about understanding, all education is political. This is fantastic. This is more me, sorry. All education is political. Even if we think it is not. Those who think education needs to be neutral and apolitical, that's a politics. It's a politics of the status quo. Now, to me, that's not what we're about. So, highlighting that politics, owning it, but not in a dictatorial type of way, in a kind of a dialogical, open, critical, reflexive way is really important. And we need pedagogies which help us to do that, okay? To question all of our assumptions, etc. So in terms of, sorry, I'm back to where I was a minute ago, sorry. So in terms of the policy, again, there's been significant changes. In the 2003 first strategic plan for development education, the aim was to have everybody in the country would have access to development education. Think about that for a second. Every single person in the country. Now, you could say everybody gets it now in schools. You could through politics and society, or CSP at Junior Cert, or this new subject. Do they? What about older people? What about people in sports clubs, etc.? What about, to what extent is it really an everybody thing? Now, having said that, policy has really changed. We have, there's been 4 or 5 DevEd, global citizenship education policies. We have the ESD policies, the National Strategy on Anti-Racism, etc. And from a positive point of view, these have embraced globalization, citizenship, that's all great. But the question is, I suppose, to what extent they reflect the radical roots of global education. So we have seen more overlaps with the educations, as I mentioned, and more synergies, but a lot more needs to happen in those terms. We need to keep the broad critical framing of global education on the agenda. That takes work. Can't assume that happens. It takes ongoing struggle, in my view. Funding commitments do need to be implemented. So it's great to have policies, but if there's no resources or not enough resources to back them up, then that in itself is a real issue. No government, they keep doing it. Since I've been involved 30 plus years, governments have said 0.7%. Now, development cooperation is not the only or even arguably the major or most important response to global poverty and inequality, but it is essential. And the funding for global education in Ireland comes largely through that avenue, which is really brilliant, and it has been really significant. But it needs to be a lot more. And what would we spend the money on if we got it? Well, I think there's lots you could do with communities. I think there's lots you could do in building synergies, building big, broader campaigns, in education and critical education in organisations, in the public service, in Irish Aid in itself, in the National Council for Curriculum and Assessment. Like, we can't assume that everybody is really on top of decoloniality and on top of critical race theory. So all of these areas really, really need a lot of work if we are to take global education seriously. What I often think is that we see it as an add-on, just like I mentioned earlier on. The last page on the policy, it's an extra. It's a great extra for NGOs. It's a great extra in schools. But if you see it as a systemic, organisational kind of set of values and pedagogies and philosophical approaches, then you really start to see that the work really needs to continue and a lot more needs to be done. Huge work, of course, has been done in curriculum development over the years, largely down to the people in this room, working with the curriculum bodies. And so all the work that the working groups have done in keeping kind of every single time there's a consultation, people have continued to kind of plug at that, and that's really, really important. And those open, transparent policy processes and curriculum development processes have been hugely important. So we need to keep fighting for those. So lots of work still needs to be done to ensure that these are meaningful, that there are system-wide, organisational-wide changes, cultural changes, and ongoing development in various sectors. One of my things is about how weak it is in higher education, apart from in initial teacher education. But I won't go into that. And then from an organisational point of view, and I'll finish with this, again, IDEA has played a hugely significant, critical role over many years. I found these graphics on a website and I thought they were brilliant. And, you know, in pioneering, in strengthening global education, working at a European level, that's really important. We have to keep those links going. But again, we need more, I suppose, it's always more, critical and open debate. A lot of that has really worked. I think it's improved a lot with the Code of Good Practice, but we need much more public debate about the kind of education we need for our future society. That's one based on justice and equality, sustainability and human rights. That global education that brings together those various educations. We need a lot more public debate about it, and we can drive that public debate, I think. We need a strong academic and research base. That's still quite weak in Ireland, but we are working on it. But a lot more can be done in that regard, and to develop critical alternatives. So much more can be done, and I think a lot of lessons have been learnt over the last number of years. I'd just like to say that, just in summary, there have been a lot of policy developments in this area, but we really need to ensure that criticality is at their heart and that they're implemented and that it's not just tokenistic. There has been a lot of curriculum development, but that work really needs ongoing development, and we have to keep the push. I wrote in one of the last slides, which I won't show you, it's like a struggle. I've noticed that if you don't keep pushing for something, there's backlash and things get lost. And I think one of the lessons is you have to keep at it. So I think the people in this room can do that. So I would say a very strong message of the need for ongoing resourcing and support from Irish Aid and others, and much more synergies working together. That would be my message. Anyway, I really apologise for my poor voice and appreciate your patience. Thanks very much.